concrete versus purple prose. Who you choose to tell your story is going to have a lot of power. Metaphors, similes, symbolism. A cliche isn't just a familiar overused saying, it is the debris of someone else's thinking. Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. So a little while ago I mentioned the concept of potentially filming a writer's syllabus video. And honestly, if you guys want me to just like make a video on all the books that I would recommend you read instead of doing a master's degree, I could make like a miniature syllabus. So many of you guys commented on that video and you said that you wanted to see the writer's syllabus concept. And here's the thing, I started planning that video. Everything that I wanted to put into the video just started running away from me, and so it got bigger and bigger and bigger. We've had a few disasters. Okay, number one, I tried to film this video last week and I dropped the standing desk. You're currently sitting under a standing desk. I dropped this on my camera, crushed the camera, almost killed the viewfinder. Tyler pried it back together. Somehow, she's alive. You guys are being filmed right now. And also I just got overwhelmed because I tried to put too much in the video. So basically we've pared it back. I'm going to be recommending you the books that I think are the absolute perfect examples of really, really well done writing techniques. And so today we're going to be going through things like voice, purple prose versus concrete prose. We're going to be going through imagery, figurative language, perspective. I'm going to talk about some craft books. I did also want to stress up front that you do not need to read all 50-ish books that I'm going to be talking about in this video. If you've got timestamps, please feel free, like you can jump around, take what you need. I don't want to overwhelm anyone. I really just love talking about writing craft. I could talk about it forever and I wanted to be the maximum amount of helpful that I could. So today we're contending with some construction outside, we're contending with the AC, we're on a time limit. Let's see if I can recommend you roughly 47 books that I think best exemplify the types of techniques that are really, really ideal to know if you are an aspiring author. I want to explain to you the specifics of that particular writing technique and why that author is really, really good at what they do. But before we get into the writer's syllabus content, I just wanted to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Craftsy. Craftsy is a fabulous online resource for all things creative. They have classes on arts, sewing, baking, quilting, cake decorating, and so much more. I've actually been really enjoying their knitting classes. You may have before seen my fraught attempts at trying to teach myself how to knit, and so I've particularly enjoyed watching interlac knitting techniques from base triangles to knitting in the round by Mary Beth Temple. And I love that this particular technique gives off this really fun kind of argyle pattern without forcing you to knit every square individually. And it was absolutely perfect for the skill level that I'm currently at, which is very much not skilled at all. Really excited to also delve deeper into Craftsy's knitting tutorials, especially when I get a little bit more skilled, because there's a cable knitting class I really want to do. Craftsy is always adding new classes so that you can experience the joy of creating something with your own two hands. The first 1,000 of you to click the link in the description down below will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49, valid for new members only. I do want to kick off this video by speaking about voice, and specifically I would like to speak about concrete versus purple prose. Now, purple prose is the type of prose that you get that's very flowery, imagery heavy. Oftentimes the phrase purple prose gets used to criticize a writer's style, to mean that their prose is overblown or overwrought or kind of saccharine in how descriptive it is. But here's what Angela Carter thinks of her prose being called purple and overblown.
Okay, I write overblown purple self-indulgent prose, so what?
I love the energy she has in that clip. The best example of flowery, purple, beautiful, decadent prose is going to be in anything written by Angela Carter, but specifically The Bloody Chamber. I remember how that night I lay awake in the wagon lit in a tender, delicious ecstasy of excitement, my burning cheek pressed against the impeccable linen of the pillow, and the pounding of my heart mimicking that of the great pistons ceaselessly thrusting the train that bore me through the night, away from Paris, away from girlhood, away from the white enclosed quietude of my mother's apartment, into the unguessable country of marriage. The reason why this paragraph is still strong, even though it's a little bit adjective heavy, is because A, it tells us about the young woman's character. This is a Bluebeard retelling, so she is dazzled by the childlike dream of decadence, which she associates with marriage. B, it doesn't lean on cliche, so although there's a lot of description going on, everything is unique and very specific. And C, it's interesting enough that it's engaging the whole way through. This passage doesn't linger too long. This very pretty, descriptive, fairy tale-esque style serves to juxtapose with the later themes of the piece, which I won't spoil, but it's a Bluebeard retelling, so you can guess. Compare this passage by Angela Carter to something like Hemingway. Then there was the bad weather. It would come in one day when the fall was over, We would have to shut the windows in the night against the rain, and the cold wind would strip the leaves from the trees in the place Contrescarpe. The leaves lay sodden in the rain, and the wind drove the rain against the big green autobus at the terminal, and the Café des Amateurs was crowded, and the windows misted over from the heat and the smoke inside. It was a sad, evilly run cafe, with the drunkards of the quarter crowded together, and I kept away from it because the smell of the dirty bodies and the sour smell of the drunkenness. Thematically, this passage is also quite a bit less pretty than Carter's writing, but do you also hear how much shorter the sentences are? How much more definitive and no-nonsense and almost aggressively assertive they sound? There's descriptions here, but they are ordinary and common. They're also strong because they don't lean on cliche. Everything feels a little bit more grounded. And so in my opinion, Hemingway's voice is really quite opposite to Carter's voice. Two very good examples that I have here are Pachinko by Min Jin Lee and All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. Both of these are historical literary fiction. They've both won a lot of awards. They're both massive bestsellers, and they have completely opposite voices. All the Light We Cannot See is very beautiful, very imagery heavy. We can see that a lot of the chapters are quite short. We start off the story with a little chapter called Leaflets, and it doesn't even have a human focalizer. It has an omniscient, we'll talk about focalizers in a minute. It has an omniscient focalizer, and so it says, at dusk they pour from the sky, they blow across the ramparts, turn cartwheels over rooftops, flutter into the ravines between houses, entire streets swell with them, flashing white against the cobbles. Urgent message to the inhabitants of this town, they say, depart immediately to open country. The tide climbs, the moon hangs, small and yellow and gibbous, on the rooftops of beachfront hotels to the east, and in the gardens behind them 6 American artillery units drop incendiary rounds into the mouths of mortars. That's just imagery. Like, we don't even have a character who's focalizing it. It's just straight up imagery. On the other side of the spectrum though, in terms of very, very concrete prose, we have Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. The winter following Japan's invasion of Manchuria was a difficult one. Biting winds sheared through the small boarding house, and the women stuffed cotton in between the fabric layers of their garments. This thing called the Depression was found everywhere in the world, the lodgers said frequently during meals, repeating what they'd overheard from the men at the market who could read the newspaper. Poor Americans were as hungry as the poor Russians and the poor Chinese. In the name of the emperor, even ordinary Japanese went without, da-da-da-da-da. And it's very, very literal and to the point. The only bit of figurative language we have there is that we have the biting winds, because the winds are not literally biting, they're figuratively biting. That's what we mean when we say figurative language. It's not literal, but biting winds. Biting is such a ordinary descriptor of winds. It's so much of a cliche that it's not really cliche, because it's just how we kind of categorize and look at how the winds work, right? We know that the focalizers here are the borders in the house. And so here we have two literary historical novels which are beautifully written with completely opposite voices. One which is very imagery heavy and the other which is very concrete. And the ways that these authors use these techniques give off a different effect. If we're moving on to more commercial examples of voice in fiction, we can look at a book called The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart by Holly Ringland. When we speak about commercial voice, it just tends to be a little bit more palatable to wider audiences. Like, it's just a little bit easier to read. So Alice Hart is a book that I would describe as being a little bit on the flowery side. It's really beautifully written, imagery heavy, a lot of symbolism, particularly with the flowers. Even in chapter 1, we can see the symbolism of the black fire orchid. In the weatherboard house at the end of the lane, 9-year-old Alice sat at her desk by the window and dreamed of ways to set her father on fire. In front of her, on the eucalyptus desk her father built, a library book lay open. It was filled with stories collected from around the world about myths of fire. Although a northeasterly blew in from the Pacific full of brine, Alice could smell smoke, earth, and burning feathers. She read and whispered aloud, and there's a little bit about phoenixes. And so we get really, really quickly into the imagery and the symbolism of this story. So for some reason, my microphone just stops working here, but I went on to contrast The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart with Days at the Murasaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yagisawa, translated from the Japanese by Eric Ozawa. So the opening paragraph reads, "From late summer to early spring the next year, I lived at the Murasaki bookshop. I spent that period of my life in the spare room on the second floor of the store, trying to bury myself in books. The cramped room barely got any light and everything felt damp. It smelled constantly of musty old books. But I will always remember the days I spent there, because that's when my real life began. And I know without a doubt that if not for those days, the rest of my life would have been bland, monotonous, and lonely. The Murasaki bookshop is precious to me. It's a place I know I'll never forget." Days at the Murasaki bookshop Bookshop is a good example of concrete prose in a more commercial style because we start straight away with character, everything feels very grounded, down to earth, we're immediately getting small descriptions of the bookshop and nothing is too overly described. Again, these are just slightly different styles. It kind of depends on your preferences or your taste as to which one you're going to like. As long as the prose are strong and the voice is distinctive, I personally don't mind if writing is flowery or if it's concrete. These are just different literary styles, and depending on the type of story that you want to tell, you can choose to go in either direction. Moving along into figurative language generally. Figurative language is the language that we use when we're not being literal, and so metaphors, similes, symbolism, hyperbole. So metaphors such as the guitar was a pineapple. Guitars can be kind of, I'm looking at a guitar right now, it could be conceivably pineapple shaped. A guitar is like a pineapple, which is a simile. Hyperbole is when you exaggerate something, and so the guitar was ginormous would be hyperbole because I'm looking at a regular sized guitar and it is not literally ginormous, right? And so figurative language is anything that isn't literally happening. It is the opposite of concrete description. A very concrete description of this guitar would be something to the effect of, it was an orange guitar. But figurative language is something I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking to you guys about. And the best example of figurative language in a novel is definitely going to be On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. Like basically, if you want beautiful figurative language, go read a novel by someone who's also a poet, because poets they just have such a beautiful way with words. There is a quote from Donna Tartt where I think she beautifully describes the difference between poetry and novel writing.
When I was a bit older, it was poetry. All my favorite writers were poets. But
did you dream of being a poet?
Oh yeah, and still do. Yes. In vain. I mean, in order to be a good poet, you have to have an ear for language so fine that to a novelist it's really almost diseased. If I try to write a poem, if I try to concentrate upon images too heavily, a narrative will just always impose itself.
Yeah. Really beautiful example of imagery from this book. Ocean Vuong compares autumn leaves to butterflies to migration and then relates that back to the character's story of migrating from Vietnam to the US. And the way he does this with the symbolism in the story is just so beautifully done. The linking of autumn leaves, butterflies, I think fire, all of these things are orange and so they look similar. Actually, Ocean Vuong had a really good descriptor of how to write strong metaphor from his Instagram, so I'll share that here if I can. Essentially, Ocean Vuong says that metaphors should have two things: A sensory, visual, texture, sound, etc. connector between the origin image and the transforming image, and B, a clear logical connector between both images. So if you have only one of either, it's best to forego the metaphor, otherwise it will seem forced or read like writing in quotation marks, if that makes sense. For example, the road curves like a cat's tail. This is a weak metaphor because the transforming image, the tail, does not amplify or alter the original. The transfer of meaning flattens or dies, the logic is weak. A cat's tail does not really change the nature of the road or how we see the road, and you can certainly add to this with a few more expository sentences, like over-explaining it, which might rescue the logic, but then you're just doing CPR on your metaphor, and so really it's not a strong metaphor because you're having to over-explain it. The sensory element to this, well, it's not a metaphor, it's a simile, is also weak. A cat's tail has little optical resemblance to a road other than being curved. Roads are not furry, for example. So this is 0 for 2 and should therefore be scrapped. Ocean Vuong says, this is just in my opinion though, not a rule, but here's the thing. I would listen to Ocean Vuong. He's a really talented writer. His figurative language is some of the best I've ever read. I think he's so talented. So personally, I would take this advice because I think it's really solid. So what about the road runs between two groves of pine like the first stroke of a buzz cut? This is better, he says. The optical sensory of the transforming image, which is the clipper through a head of hair, matches well with the original, which is the road, but the logic feels arbitrary. Again, it doesn't substantially alter the original image. It doesn't substantially add value to what we're learning. In the end, this is just an interesting image, but not strong enough to keep it. It's not telling us anything really interesting about the road. It's not changing our opinion. Now compare this to an example from Sharon Olds. The hair on my father's arms like blades of molasses. The sensory connector is there, check. A man's dark hair indeed can look like blades of molasses, and it's also suggestive of grass. The logical connector is also there, check. The father is both sharp and sweet, something once soft and sticky about him. Connotations of youth, sweets has now hardened, and the confection is no longer fresh, etc. It's an ambitious metaphor that's packed with resonance and meaning and levels. In other words, it does worlds of work and actually deepens the more you sit with it. A metaphor that actually invites you to put the book down, think on it, absorb it before returning. A metaphor uses detours to add power to the text. Poor metaphors distract you from the text and leave you bereft, laid to the side. There's a few more slides here to the Instagram stories, so I definitely recommend you guys checking this out and giving it a read. I'll link Ocean Vuong's Instagram in the description down below, but I love this advice. This was the best description of metaphors, similes. These are similes here technically, not metaphors, but the best descriptions of figurative language that I've ever read. And again, I would back in Ocean Vuong's advice. So go read this because it's really good. And so, of course, in On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, he compares autumn, butterflies, and all of these orange things together. Autumn, somewhere over Michigan, a colony of monarch butterflies numbering more than 15,000 are beginning their yearly migration south. In the span of 2 months, from September to November, they will move one wing beat at a time from Southern California and the United States to portions of central Mexico, where they will spend the winter. They perch among us on windowsills and chain link fences, clotheslines still blurred from the just hung weight of clothes and the hood of a faded blue Chevy, their wings folding slowly as if being put away before snapping once into flight. It only takes a single night of frost to kill off a generation. To live then is a matter of timing. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. As I said, if you really want to learn about figurative language, pick up novels that are written by poets. The fig tree metaphor from the Bell Jar has to be one of the most, I think, moving and profound metaphors I've ever read. I read this when I was 16 and it just means so much to me. I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor, and another fig was E.G., the amazing editor, and another fig was Europe and Africa and South America, and another fig was Constantine and Socrates and Attila, and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions, and another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion, and beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death, just because I couldn't make up my mind of which of the figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest, and as I sat there, unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one they plopped to the ground by my feet. Such a beautiful and strong metaphor. And I think the main thing for me with figurative language is that you don't want to put in figurative language literally just for the sake of having pretty sounding words. Like, there's a really big difference between beautiful, purple, decadent prose that actually create an emotional effect on the reader and having prose that are overwrought and saccharine, and they go past the point of having an emotional impact and actually just making the reader feel nothing. Everything we do when we write, in my opinion, obviously I'm not an expert, I should have put that sandbag in at the beginning, and normally I do. Obviously all of this is just my opinion, and I'm not a best-selling author, so please don't feel like you need to listen to me. But if we are here to listen to my opinion, I mean, you clicked on this video, but yeah, I think in my opinion, the only reason you should put in figurative language, a metaphor, a simile, a symbol, whatever it is if it's going to change the way your reader thinks about that particular object or that particular symbol in relation to your character or in relation to your plot. I use this example a lot, but it's a good one, so I'll use it again. Say we were looking at describing a bus. These kids in this particular hypothetical story are looking at a bus. They're about to get on the bus on the way to school or whatever. So if we wanted to describe that with really concrete imagery and not figurative imagery, we would say something like, the school bus is yellow. But if we want to describe the school bus with figurative language, we're going to change how we describe it based on how the characters see the school bus, what we want to relate back to the reader based on how our point of view characters' brains work. So if the child was a little bit younger, say if they really, really loved school and it was this beautiful, innocent, happy thing for them, they might say that the school bus was yellow like a daisy. And so this is a simile to mean that the school bus was happy and bright and summery and all of this like very, very happy, innocent imagery, right? If we had an older student who was a little bit more darker in their psychology, maybe they didn't like school, maybe it didn't feel very safe for them, they might describe the school bus as being crime scene tape yellow. And then if you had a kid from the country who was maybe like the child of a farmer, they might describe it as being corn cob yellow. And so that piece of imagery is not there to add flavor or to take up words or just to kind of fill in spaces. It's there to teach you something about the person who's narrating your story. It's there to change the way you look at those objects. Like literally, if we get into semiotics, the point of the symbol is to change how we relate to the physical object. So we can learn a lot about our protagonist or our focalizers through how they see the world, and figurative language is a really, really important way of how we do that. Of course, if you want to learn more about figurative language or anything kind of adjacent to poetics, these techniques like metaphor, imagery, symbolism, all of these kinds of things, a really, really good thing to do is to just literally pick up some poetry collections and check out the work of some poets. And so my favorite poet of all time is T.S. Eliot. This is a really nice little collection of his poetry, which is The Wasteland and other poems. My favorite poem of all time is The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. In terms of more modern poetry, I really love Jen Campbell's work. She's also a YouTuber. I will link her channel down below. I think she's great. But this is her most recent poetry collection, which is called Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit. This is beautiful. It has such beautiful, beautiful, beautiful imagery here. Moving into imagery kind of broadly, there are so many books that I could recommend to you guys for this particular area. For me personally, I love a story that leans a little bit towards the purple, but not totally. Like, I like a book that has really pretty, decadent imagery. I love natural imagery. I love teapots and atmospheric things. I love whimsy. I love magic. Anything that's really like high concept, that is my jam. But the thing is as well that I need like shade to that light. I kind of need there to be something dark or emotional or vulnerable to the story to make all of the pretty imagery feel real. I think personally for me, if a story doesn't have that light and shade, it's going to feel a little bit too saccharine. Like, I want there to be something gritty to latch onto, and then I want all of the comfort of all of the pretty imagery as well, if that makes sense. And so basically, I'm going to recommend to you The Secret History by Donna Tartt and also The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Both of these have absolutely stunning imagery. My favorite bit of imagery from The Secret History, I think, is when we first get to Julian's office and Richard is describing the way the office looks. My tab just says imagery. It was a beautiful room, not an office at all, and much bigger than it looked from the outside, airy and white with a high ceiling and a breeze fluttering in the starched curtains. In the corner, near a low bookshelf, was a big round table littered with teapots and Greek books, and there were flowers everywhere, roses and carnations and anemones. I'm sorry. On his desk, on the table, in the windowsills, the roses were especially fragrant. Their smell hung rich and heavy in the air, mingled with the smell of bergamot and black china tea and a faint inky scent of camphor. Breathing deep, I felt intoxicated. Everywhere I looked was something beautiful. Oriental rugs, porcelains, tiny paintings like jewels, a dazzle of fractured colour that struck me as if I'd stepped into one of those little Byzantine churches that are so plain on the outside. Inside, the most paradisal painted eggshell of gilt and tesserae. That's one of my favorite paragraphs I've ever read in my life. I love that. I love that so much. And I think as well, what makes for really, really strong imagery is the specificity. So Donna Tartt in this particular passage, she doesn't just say there are flowers and there are books and there are curtains. She says that the curtains are starched. She actually tells you about the stiffness of the curtains. And so when the breeze blows through, you can kind of see how they move. She speaks about the specific kinds of flowers that are in the office, such as carnations and roses, even down to the fact that she describes the table as being circular, whereas most tables tend to be square or rectangular. The fact that the table in Julian's office is circular is a little bit abnormal, and this kind of specificity and the describing of things that are just a little bit abnormal, a little bit unexpected, that's what's going to really stick with the reader, and that's what the reader's imagination is really going to latch onto, right? There's this really, really famous rule in writing, specifically that relates to imagery, which says that you shouldn't describe a castle brick by brick. Just say it was a castle. You don't have to describe every single tiny part in order for the reader to get the picture. And the thing is that when you're writing a story, you are managing the resources of how many words you have at your disposal. For every single big passage of imagery, you only have so many words that you can allot to that. And also, you have to be really, really careful about not bogging down your reader with too much description, because if you do too much description, it's going to be really, really boring. And so you have to be really, really careful to make sure that if you want to draw attention to a specific room, a specific house, a specific thing, you can't do that too frequently. And so we know in The Secret History that Julian's office is really, really special and really important. Part of the reason why there's such a big passage of imagery there is because Julian represents to Richard, our main character, Julian represents the kind of ideal academic. Julian is the human embodiment of the romanticism of academia. And so this space where he spends his time is really, really important to Richard. The imagery there is beautiful, but it's not just beautiful for the sake of being beautiful. It does mean something for Richard's characterization. And the fact that Richard early on in the story latches so much onto the beauty of this space, it kind of depicts really early on his yearning for this kind of highly aesthetic ideal, which relates back to the key themes of the story. And so that imagery, again, while being beautiful in and of itself, is being used to do something. It's teaching us about Richard's characterization. It's teaching us about the world that he is yearning for. His great hamasha, his fatal flaw, is the fact that he has this, what is the quote? He has a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. And so that imagery directly builds that part of Richard's character so that we as the reader can believe it. I also want to give the picture of Dorian Gray as my example, just because I love this book. I think the imagery is so beautifully done. It's so decadent. I think this is also a great study in dialogue. I'm going to talk about dialogue. Actually, I don't think that I talk about dialogue, so I can quickly talk about it here. If you want to read good dialogue, read the books that are also written by playwrights, because playwrights, screenwriters, their entire craft is based around dialogue. A screenplay is told 90% through the dialogue. So if you want to improve your dialogue, go read some screenplays. The picture of Dorian Gray has such beautiful imagery, but also really good dialogue. Henry's dialogue is so much fun. The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amidst the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. This is going to be way too much imagery for me to read to you. But basically, we start off with roses and perfume and this very aromatic description of imagery, which relates to sensory imagery of the nose and the perfume of the flowers and how intoxicating this is. And this is, of course, a really important metaphor for Dorian Gray, because Dorian ends up becoming corrupted. And so we look at the senses as a corrupting force a lot in this story. And so the imagery at the beginning, again, is really, really beautiful, but it introduces us to the key themes of the story, the idea of chasing after the senses. We're going to have a brief intermission. I may come back in a different outfit, BRB. So, one brief intermission later. Hello everyone, hi. It is the very next day, and here's the thing with me. I am such a chronic yapper about bookish things that I spoke for an hour and 40 minutes yesterday, and I only made it through 14 of the 47 books I originally listed. Here, I don't think it's still 47 books. I've taken away a couple and I've added a couple, but essentially I want to finish this video and I still want to cover the breadth of books, because I really do want to give you as many really good examples of these techniques or these facets of writing as I absolutely can. So we're gonna move along. We're gonna keep going with the video. Now we're gonna kick it off today by speaking about perspective. Now perspective is such an important part of storytelling, because who you choose to tell your story is going to have a lot of power in what they see and what information they reveal and how close they are to your reader. For example, you could tell your story in first person, and one of my favorite examples of this is Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, translated from the Japanese by J. Rubin. This is a story which kicks off with an older man sitting on a plane remembering his time in Tokyo during the 1960s when he was a student. It's told in the first person, which means that the author uses a lot of words like I and me and I went and did this thing and I went to the shops. Everything relates back to what is happening inside the character's head. The story is being told to themselves. And so Norwegian Wood is a really excellent example of this, because this book is so emotional and introspective, and first person can be a really, really good way for an author to become really emotionally close to a reader really quickly. I should say, obviously, Murakami, content warnings abound in this book. This book is really depressing. I love it to bits. It's great. First person is really good in this context because you're putting the reader right into the psychology of the person narrating the story. We're inside their head. We can see everything they see. However, the limitation of this is that we can't necessarily see into the internal worlds of the other characters. Another mode that you can use for perspective is something called the second person, which instead of using the word I, uses the word you. You went to the shops, you went and bought a book, you did this, you did that. I'm telling you the story about you, which is a much less common mode for authors to use because it can sometimes feel a little bit tedious. Second person stories are more likely to be short stories. They're more likely to be used for a smaller amount of time. An excellent example of second person usage is in the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. I think just generally, if you're interested in perspective and learning how perspective works, this is the book you should definitely pick up because it's told from 3 different perspectives. One of them is in first person, one of them is in second person, one of them is in third person, and this story is just masterfully done. Moving into third person limited. So there are a few different ways that you can do third person. Third person is very common, but third person limited would be a book like Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I had to bring it up at some point, guys. I had to shoehorn it in here. Third person limited, instead of using I or you, it uses the character's name. It places the reader just outside of the head of the character. And so, for example, we have the character of Sophie in Howl's Moving Castle. Sophie went to the shops, Sophie bought an apple, Sophie met Howl, da-da-da-da-da. We're not directly inside of her head in terms of the narration, but that doesn't mean that we're not seeing the world from her perspective. So when we have third person limited and the author has chosen to limit that story to just one character, it means that although the narration makes it sound like we're outside of that character's head, what we're actually seeing is still the world from their eyes. We're seeing the world colored by their perspective, by their experience, and by their biases. And so nothing happens in the story that we know that Sophie doesn't know. You can also have third person limited to multiple characters, and so a good example of this would be Stoner by John Williams, which I recently finished, and God, I love this book. It's such a beautiful, slow college novel, beautifully written, just gorgeous storytelling. This story is told like 90% from the perspective of the titular character of Stoner. However, there are little bits where we see perspectives from Edith, from his parents, from various different characters that pop in where it's convenient to the plot or where the author has decided to give us a little bit more information that we couldn't get directly from Stoner. Now, this is really important because this main character is not terribly emotionally intelligent, and so there are a lot of things that he misses. He doesn't really introspect super duper clearly, and so there are little moments where we actually need to dip into the consciousnesses of different characters to work out what's going on because Stoner's not actually picking up on everything that's going on. And so 90% of that book is told from his perspective. It's third person limited, but every now and then it'll pop into the focalization of a different character. Now, what do I mean by focalization? Focalization is a really fancy way of saying perspective. Every story ever told is going to be told from the perspective of someone, whether that someone is an all-seeing, all-knowing presence such as a god, or if it's time itself. So, for example, in To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, there's a section in the middle of this story where time is the focalizer, and so there's no human perspective that's perceiving the world. It's time narrating the middle of this story. To explain really clearly the way this works, I'm going to use one of my favorite examples from Anne of Green Gables. It's a scene where Anne runs into the kitchen and Mrs. Lynde sees her for the first time. So all the context you really need is that Anne has been adopted by Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Lynde is friends with Marilla, and so I'm going to read out this particular paragraph and then I'm going to explain what's going on. Anne came running in presently, her face sparkling with the delight of her orchard rovings, but abashed at finding herself in the unexpected presence of a stranger, she halted confusedly inside the door. She certainly was an odd-looking little creature in the short, tight, wincey dress she had worn from the asylum, below which her thin legs seemed ungracefully long. And so we have this scene where Anne runs into the room, and then this other woman sees Anne and perceives her. This paragraph is told from 2 different perspectives, even though it's in the exact same paragraph. So Anne comes running in presently, her face is sparkling with the delight of her orchard rovings. Someone else is perceiving that, and then we jump into Anne's focalization. So Anne is feeling abashed. She halts confusedly. She feels confused, right? If this was happening outside of her head, we could say things like, Anne looked confused or Anne seemed abashed, but this particular sentence is focalized by Anne, the child, running into the room. The next sentence is actually focalized by Mrs. Lynde, the character who is perceiving Anne. Anne certainly was an odd-looking little creature in the short, tight, wincey dress she had worn from the asylum, below which her thin legs seemed ungracefully long, and so this is very much colored by Mrs. Lynde's perspective. She thinks that Anne is odd-looking. She notices that Anne's dress from the children's home, because Anne was adopted, she was an orphan, is short, tight and wincey, so the dress is cheap. So we get this adult focalization from Mrs. Lynde, which I've highlighted in blue. Anne's perspective is contrasted with Mrs. Lynde's very adult utilitarian perspective of thinking, oh, this child has grown out of her clothes, she looks unwell, she's a bit ungraceful. And so we see that even though this is the exact same paragraph, we have two very different perspectives here, which in a contrasting way teaches us a lot about these two different characters. They're very opposite in terms of their age, their background, their place in the village. Anne is an outsider coming in. Mrs. Lynde is very grandfathered in. All of this delightful information and detail you pick up in the subtext because of this shift in focalizers that happens between the yellow sentence and the blue sentence. So when you have a story with multiple focalizers, it's much more common for that to be told in the third person. It's entirely possible to have a story told from the first person with multiple first person narrators. It just tends to be a lot more confusing and it's really hard to get right. It's really hard to remember people's names and to remember who people are. So it is done every now and again, but it's not super common. But now that we know the difference between multiple focalizers, how do authors best switch between these? So in the example of Stoner by John Williams, this will tend to switch per paragraph where it's needed. In an example like What You Were Looking For Is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama, translated from the Japanese by Alison Watts, this is more rigorously segmented. The first story starts off with Tomaka, 21, women's wear sales assistant, and every subsequent chapter is told from the perspective of a different person and relates back to this one singular library. This type of structure is also really common in fantasy. The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon is an excellent example of this. This is told from the perspective of 4 different characters and we dip back and forth between their perspectives as structured by the chapters. What also can sometimes happen in fantasy is omniscient narration. Now we'll just hold up the whole of the Lord of the Rings here for this one. Omniscient narration is a little bit different from third person limited because it kind of is a free-for-all where it feels like God is narrating the story and they can dip in and out of the brains of anyone at any point. Generally, the best examples of omniscient narration tend to be in fairy tales. They tend to be in these kinds of stories that feel like they're relaying myths, and so we don't really get much perspective into the internal worlds of the characters. You might have Sleeping Beauty feeling a bit heartbroken or feeling a bit this or a bit that, but you don't really see the world perfectly from her perspective, if that makes sense. Really good for telling these big, huge, sweeping epics, but you might not want to use this voice if you want to explore emotional story with a lot of introspection. Again, the main thing here being that you want to look at all of these techniques and think really critically about what you want to achieve and what you want your story to be, and then using those techniques to best serve your actual goals. I didn't originally have a section for character here, but I was reading this passage in Sea Green last night, which is a story that got published recently by a small press. My friend Marina and I went to the launch and it was this beautiful event. There were pink frog cakes. I haven't actually ever eaten because apparently they taste really bad, but they're like these fondant cakes and they're iconic, and we don't have that many South Australian foods is basically what I'm saying. But there was this one passage of character that I wanted to read because I felt like it built up the character of the parents in this story so well and so quickly. So we have this paragraph: my father was a sensitive plant that early withered. He needed more fertile pastures. A family wasn't enough. To save himself, he should have left us. Because he was honorable, perhaps because his talent wasn't big enough, he stayed and became a man who dwelt uneasily in a woman's house, a stranger who acceded to my mother's every whim, yet couldn't give her what she really wanted, his love. And oh my God, that is so beautifully done. That's so so tragic, that so clearly paints his character in an incredibly beautiful way. But also, I've seen this man before. This is a really, really honest and vulnerable depiction of a human being's characterization. And so when it comes to character, as I said, I haven't planned anything for character specifically. I'd love to go into character more eventually because character I love, but I think with character, the best thing you can be is honest and specific. Again, it's the same thing with imagery. Like, you want to be really, really specific, and you don't want to lean on cliches because cliches make you feel absolutely nothing. And I think just being really interested in people and looking at people's idiosyncrasies and thinking about, well, what makes that person unique? What is a contradiction in that person? That is the type of thing I really value when it comes to character. And so I've been really, really enjoying this. It's a very literary, beautifully written story. Yeah, brilliant. For books that I recommend you read when it comes to structure, I definitely start with Frankenstein. This is a story within a story within a story. So it is a framed text. This is a not uncommon Gothic mode, and it's a symmetrical frame text. And so we begin with the perspective of Walton. He's writing letters to his sister. He goes to the Arctic and he meets a man who says, let me tell you a story. And then we go into this man's story. Then he meets someone else who says, let me tell you a story. We go into that story, and then we come out in the exact same way. And so it's symmetrically framed. You can also get stories like The Turn of the Screw, which I love because it's unsymmetrically framed. And so we start with these people at a party who say, let me tell you a story, this creepy thing happened, and we get the story and then we never return to them, and that has a very different effect on the reader. And so Frankenstein is told in this really satisfying, structured, symmetrical kind of way. Something like The Turn of the Screw is deliberately designed to make you feel uneasy. I also love the way the series of Unfortunate Events books are structured because it's 13 books, they're all 13 chapters, and I am a sucker for fun little structural things like that. Like for Spiegel Tent, the novel I'm currently working on, I'm doing the same thing where I want it to have 13 chapters because I just think that's really fun. I think it's a really fun challenge to try and look at a novel through that kind of structural lens. And so for Spiegel Tent, I'm specifically looking at unlucky numbers, and so everything is done in 13s and 4s because that's the type of thing that I find absolutely delightful in a story. There are so many fun things you can do with structure. You can have a story like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell having footnotes as well. John Green also tends to have really interesting structures in his stories. So in Looking for Alaska, first part of the book, every day is counting down to something. The chapter headings are like counting down. This is not a good example for a book, but it is of a screenplay. I really like the film Memento because it's told out of chronological order.
You have the beginning of the film here. That's basically the end of the movie. This stuff is the black and white stuff. This is color, and this is running backwards as a series of jumps. And what we do is we cut between the two the whole way through. So we alternate scene here, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, and they meet towards the end of the film.
Again, there's so many structures I could bring up, and I'm trying to be really rapid fire here. Of course, Hero's Journey is a really, really popular one. So think The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, Star Wars, this kind of person, Harry Potter, like leaves home, goes on an adventure, comes back. There's a whole structure here that gets followed again and again and again. A really helpful one to know though is the Bildungsroman, which is a fancy way of saying a coming of age story. So what's really interesting, I was going to bring this up in a second, The Name of the Wind is a Bildungsroman split into 3 different books. And so I think that's part of why people are so heartbroken that we still don't have the 3rd Kingkiller book, because it's not a complete story. It's not like a regular trilogy where you get the first book and then that's a complete story, the second book is a complete story, third book is a complete story. The Name of the Wind is one structured Bildungsroman split into 3. Oh my god, it's getting really cold here. I'm sorry. We're getting into the cozy part of the video. Another really good example is of course Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I really want to reread this book, I will warn you. Beautifully told. I love Mrs. Havisham. It is the only book I fell asleep in the library reading when I was at university. I was very sleep deprived. I did find it a bit dull. I would like to reread it and give it another go, but it is an excellent example of a Bildungsroman structure. Another fun one is the artist's coming of age story, which is the Künstlerroman, which I'm currently looking at because Spiegel Tent is a novel about arty things things and artists. And so Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Really, really quickly, I wanted to give you some rapid fire book recommendations based on genre fiction. So for each of these respective genres, I want to recommend you one book. I do think it's really, really important to read outside of the typical books that you read. Like if you're really, really into romance, there are things that you can learn from reading classics or reading thrillers. Or say, for example, you're really, really into fantasy, there are things that you can learn from reading Shakespeare or from reading self-help books. Like I think reading widely is such an important part of being a writer because it gives you context and it allows you to think outside of your usual box of thinking. But basically anyway, for the horror genre, I want to recommend Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. Beautiful water imagery, body horror, not as bad as The Substance. God, I'm a little traumatized. It's been like 4 days since I watched that and it's beautiful book. I love it so much. Dual perspective, one is in the present tense, one is in the past tense, and the way that interplays together is really cool in terms of how it reveals the mystery. For pure Gothic, modern Gothic, I want to recommend Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I love this book. It has a really, really interesting examination of Gothic tropes. I love the characters, really creepy. This could also kind of a little bit go in the horror genre, but neither of these books are particularly scary. For dystopian, I feel like you absolutely cannot go past Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. Octavia E. Butler is an absolute genius. I adore her. These books are so cool. They were written in the 90s and they feel strangely, scarily prophetic. Probably the best structured duology I've ever read. I love the ending. I love the characterization here. I love that the second book took all of the strengths of the first book and just heightened it. I will say particularly though, lots of content warnings in these books because it's dystopian fiction and it does not pull its punches. For pure sci-fi, I would recommend Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. It's a classic. It was written in the 1960s. Does not feel like it was written in the 1960s. It's very, very different from Blade Runner. I actually didn't watch Blade Runner until relatively recently, but love this book. I think it's excellent. I really need to get a copy of it. In terms of romance, now I'm not really a romance reader. My favorite romance books that I've read have all been by Emily Henry, and I'd probably recommend Book Lovers above anything else. I think her characters are really wholesome and interesting and relatively well-rounded. For more commercial historic, I'd recommend The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I love this book. It's such a good book. It's such a fast read. It's very, very different to something like Pachinko or All the Light We Cannot See in that it has a much more commercial voice. It is easier to read. In some ways, it's more fun to read though because it's much more quickly paced. It doesn't matter which of these avenues you choose to go down as a writer. It just depends on what kind of stories you find fun, what you find interesting, and what you want to achieve. So for commercial, historic fiction, Evelyn Hugo is the one I would recommend. I love it to bits. For a myth retelling, we're going to have a second TikTok book here with The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is a gorgeous retelling of the myth of Patroclus and Achilles. I love it to bits. God, I bawled my eyes out. In terms of pure secondary world fantasy, I want to recommend The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Just beautiful storytelling, beautiful, beautiful world building. And then moving into more literary genre fiction, which is my specific realm that I adore to absolute bits. And so I think just generally, I really should say this, the most ambitious fantasy novel that's been written since Tolkien, in my opinion, is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This is a Regency pastiche that came out in the early 2000s, and the style of the voice here is so strong, it feels like it was written during the time of Jane Austen. This book is just so incredibly special. It is 1,000 pages long. A lot of people do find it really intimidating and quite slow. It's worth it though. I love this book to bits. I also want to recommend Piranesi by Susanna Clarke as this really beautiful, literary leaning, speculative novel about a man who lives in a house that contains the ocean. This is one of my favorite books of all time. Gently, dark academia story, really cool structure, really cool epistolary elements. So it's told through journal entries. If you're interested in structure, if you're interested in voice, honestly, just pick up this book. It's so beautifully done. For interesting other speculative fiction, I can't even really say because I don't want to give it away. If I tell you the genres that are in this book, it's going to give away spoilers, but basically please go read Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is one of my favorite books of all time. It kind of starts off as a boarding school novel. It is gut-wrenching and so beautifully done, and it examines humanity. And then in terms of literary fantasy, literary magical stories, I definitely recommend Strange Beasts Beasts of China by Yang Yi, which is translated from Mandarin, I'm pretty sure, by Jeremy Tiang. This is a story about a city in China where there are beasts roaming everywhere, and it's about this cryptozoologist who's going around and she's like writing about the beasts, and it's kind of told in this fragmentary way about each respective beast, and you learn more about the city and the characters as the story goes along, and it's beautifully done. I love it so much. And then finally, for the final category, I did want to move into non-fiction recommendations, and so kicking off with The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. John Green is such a talented writer. I love the audiobook for this. Craft books tend to be really hit or miss for me. So the first one I want to recommend is called Several Short Sentences About Writing by Veralyn Klinkenborg. I realize that's the first time I've actually pronounced that out loud, so I had to think about it for a second. I read this book relatively recently, and I think there's a lot of really beautiful passages in it. I think it would be more helpful to a person who is just starting out with writing, especially if you want to work on your prose. And so there are sections of this book which are really beautifully done. I especially love that at the end of the book, there's a whole section where the writer is critiquing sentences that are a bit clunky or could be made a bit better. So I think if you're a beginner writer, there's a lot that you can gain out of reading this book. I'll just read this little passage on cliche. A cliche is dead matter. It causes gangrene in the prose around it, and sooner or later it eats your brain. You can't fix a cliche by using it ironically. You can't make it less gangrenous by appearing to quote it or invert it or joke about it. A cliche isn't just a familiar overused saying, it is the debris of someone else's thinking. Any group of words that seem to cluster together naturally and enlist in your sentence, the only thing to do with a cliche is to send it to the sports page or to the speechwriters where it will live forever. I also want to recommend The Anatomy of Story or The Anatomy of Storytelling. I'm only halfway through reading this book. I'm just picking away at it really slowly, and it's already my favorite craft book I've ever read. I think if you're a brand new emerging writer and you haven't written that much, you haven't written a novel before, go and pick up this book. And the fact that I'm recommending it before even having finished it, I think speaks volumes. I got this book recommendation out of watching Lindsay Puckett's channel. I love her channel. She does these breakdowns on publishing trends in children's and YA fiction. While we're here, just quickly, I also love Chris's channel and I love Lynn's channel. If you're into writing and you like my videos, please go check out their channels as well. Last two books I want to talk about are The Elements of Style by William Shrunk Jr. This is an excellent tiny little book on grammar. I still reference this. This is admittedly more helpful if you're American. This features American English. It is slightly different to British English or Australian English, but I think this is a really good little grammar book that's not overwhelming. It's very famous and well known. If you're interested in grammar, if you want to learn a little bit, I would recommend this one. And then finally, Narratology, Introduction to the Theory of Narrative by Mika Ball. Someone corrected my pronunciation of her name in the last video. I think it's Mika. I actually don't know. I really should look that up. This is a textbook that I read during university. This is how I learned about focalization. I don't recommend necessarily buying this because it's an expensive textbook, but if you can borrow it from the library, it's a really interesting academic look on storytelling. Absolutely unnecessary. If you're starting out with writing, do not bother with this. But if you're really interested in the craft of writing, if you've studied English before, if you think you would enjoy something a little bit more technical, I do recommend this book. I think it's so fascinating and I've really loved reading it. And that is everything. I'm sorry I had to speed through it a little bit at the end, but again, one-bedroom apartment, meetings, time crunch, I do not stop talking when it comes to books and writing and craft things. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope there was enough depth here. I hope you learned something from it. And I would love to make more videos like this in the future if you guys are super interested in it. So if there's anything specific you want me to go into more depth with in the future, please let me know. Thank you very much for watching. And also before I go, I wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon for watching my videos. Without the beautiful people over on Patreon, I wouldn't be able to sit here and yap about books for a sum total of 2.5 hours is where we are for this video. God help me with the editing. Over on Patreon we have a whole bunch of bonus content, our book club, our Discord server, so many things. So if you'd like to check out Patreon, there is a link in the description down below. Take care everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.